The chamber was buzzing with restless energy, but when Karoline Leavitt's voice broke through, the air seemed to freeze. Her words weren't sharp or commanding as usual. They were trembling. For the first time, the woman known for arrogance, dismissive remarks, and partisan swagger sounded small, cornered, almost desperate. Congresswoman Crockett, I'm asking you, please, drop this lawsuit. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. A voice that once mocked opponents now cracked with panic. The request wasn't bold. It was a plea. The $80 million lawsuit hanging over her head had transformed her from attacker to supplicant. And in that moment, all of Congress saw the shift. Across the table sat Jasmine Crockett, still as stone, her gaze unshaken. No rush to reply. No scramble for words, just silence. A silence louder than any shout. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of the scene. Leavitt's hands fidgeting, her lips tight, eyes darting for sympathy. And Crockett's calm, almost icy composure. The contrast was breathtaking. Here was one woman unraveling, begging for an escape from accountability. And across from her, a woman who had faced years of belittlement, who had built her career on fighting for those denied dignity, simply waiting. The room leaned forward. Staffers, reporters, even members of Congress sensed it. Something monumental was about to unfold, because Crockett hadn't said a word yet, and when she finally opened her mouth, it wouldn't just be an answer to Leavitt's desperate plea. It would be a response so cold, so precise, that it would leave the entire chamber frozen in stunned silence. But before that devastating reply, before the words that would ripple far beyond Capitol Hill, we need to understand the stakes of this $80 million battle and why Karoline Leavitt's begging was only the beginning of her downfall. That number didn't just hang in the air, it thundered. It wasn't abstract, it wasn't symbolic. It was a figure big enough to ruin a career, sink a reputation, and expose every crack in a political facade. For Karoline Leavitt, it meant her entire world could collapse overnight. The lawsuit Crockett had filed wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a meticulously prepared case, backed with documents, testimonies, and a narrative of wrongdoing so detailed that even seasoned analysts admitted this was a storm Leavitt might not survive. And she knew it. That's why her plea wasn't calculated strategy. It was raw fear. An $80 million judgment would do more than drain her finances. It would shred her political capital, strip away donors, and stain her name forever. Her allies whispered in closed rooms, if she loses this, she's done. Even her mentors, usually quick to defend her, had gone suspiciously quiet. But here's where the stakes reached beyond Leavitt herself. Crockett made it clear from the beginning. This lawsuit wasn't just personal, it was principled. It wasn't about revenge, but accountability. It wasn't about silencing an opponent, but standing up to a system that too often rewards arrogance and dismisses justice. Crockett's team called it the $80 million reckoning. Commentators framed it as a test of whether truth could finally corner political power. And for millions of Americans watching, the case became something more. A symbol of every time corruption had gone unchecked, every time arrogance had walked away unscathed. For Leavitt, the stakes were survival. For Crockett, the stakes were justice. And yet, even as Leavitt begged, Crockett didn't blink. Her calm silence wasn't cruelty, it was power. It was the power of someone who knew that bending now would undo years of fighting. If she dropped the lawsuit, it wouldn't just let Leavitt off the hook. It would signal that truth could once again be bargained away. That's why the begging felt so jarring. This wasn't just another political spat. It was the sight of someone watching their empire teeter, realizing the reckoning they once mocked was finally at their doorstep. And still, Crockett hadn't spoken because she understood something Leavitt didn't. In moments like these, silence is the prelude to impact. The cold response was coming, and when it landed, it wouldn't just devastate Leavitt, it would shock Congress to its core. But before that devastating reply, we need to pull back the curtain on Leavitt herself. The arrogance, the history, and the irony of how someone who once mocked accountability ended up begging for it. To understand the desperation in Karoline Leavitt's voice that day, you have to remember the Karoline Leavitt of yesterday. The one who used to strut into hearings with a smirk plastered on her face. The one who sneered at opponents, rolled her eyes at hard questions, and dismissed entire communities with the flick of a phrase. She was the protege of arrogance, the apprentice of power politics. Known for her quick temper and sharper tongue, Leavitt had carved out a brand as the voice of uncompromising partisanship. She prided herself on never backing down, but never backing down often meant steamrolling anyone who dared to challenge her. In press conferences, she was the one who mocked opponents as weak or irrelevant. On the campaign trail, she painted herself as untouchable, bulletproof. Even in congressional sessions, she was the figure who interrupted, grandstanded, and acted as if she were auditioning for a viral clip rather than governing a nation. It worked, for a time. Donors flocked to her firebrand style. Right-wing media amplified her every sneer. She seemed unstoppable. And with each step up the ladder, her confidence grew bolder, her smirk sharper. But arrogance has a funny way of planting the seeds of downfall. For every sneer, there was someone silently taking notes. For every mockery, there was someone waiting for the chance to push back. And among those people was Jasmine Crockett. Crockett had watched as Leavitt dismissed legitimate concerns with sarcasm. She had seen her bully witnesses in hearings, shutting them down with arrogance instead of addressing facts. And Crockett knew that when arrogance goes unchecked, it festers. That's why the lawsuit hit Leavitt so hard. Because for the first time, the roles had flipped. The woman who once called others irrelevant was now forced to plead for her own relevance. The woman who once laughed off accountability was now staring straight into the jaws of it. Her panic wasn't just about money, it was about humiliation. Leavitt's entire brand was built on control, on dominance. And here she was, begging for mercy in front of the very people she once belittled. The irony was thick, and the room felt it. Even her allies seemed to sense the unraveling. Whispers grew louder. She's losing it. This could end her. She wasn't ready for this fight. Donors who once lined up for her fiery rhetoric started to vanish, unwilling to hitch their fortunes to a sinking ship. For Leavitt, this lawsuit wasn't just a legal battle, it was the collapse of a carefully manufactured persona. And the panic was written all over her. The sharp tongue was gone, replaced by stammered pleas. The smug smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight, fearful expression. And yet, through it all, Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She hadn't uttered a word. She hadn't granted Leavitt the relief of even acknowledging her desperation. That silence, the refusal to play into the theatrics, was more devastating than any insult could be. Because Crockett understood what the room was beginning to realize. Leavitt was no longer the antagonist in control of the stage. She was the cautionary tale, the unraveling figure of arrogance meeting its overdue reckoning. But Crockett's strength wasn't born overnight. To truly grasp why her silence carried so much weight, you have to know her story. The struggles she faced, the battles she fought, and the resilience that made her unshakable in this very moment. If Karoline Leavitt's panic was the unraveling of arrogance, then Jasmine Crockett's composure was the triumph of resilience. Because the truth is, Crockett didn't arrive in Congress with silver spoons or insider shortcuts. She came from the fire, and that fire forged the steel the world now sees whenever she sits behind a microphone. Long before she was silencing political bullies, Jasmine Crockett was standing in courtrooms as a defense attorney. Not glamorous, high-profile federal cases. We're talking about the gritty, unpolished, everyday fights, the kind where the stakes weren't headlines but human lives. She represented people who couldn't afford expensive legal teams. People written off, dismissed, and ignored by the same kind of arrogance Karoline Leavitt embodied. In those small, crowded courtrooms, Crockett learned something Leavitt never did. Words matter. Not flashy words meant for cameras. Not sound bites meant for donors. Real words shaped with precision, aimed at truth, and delivered with conviction. She had to be sharper, quicker, and calmer than anyone else in the room because she didn't have the luxury of losing. Those years hardened her, not in bitterness, but in discipline. Where others might shout, she measured her tone. Where others would buckle, she steadied her ground. Every case was training. Every client was a reminder of why she couldn't falter. And every setback was fuel to sharpen her edge. When she transitioned into politics, that same courtroom steel came with her. While others leaned on theatrics, Crockett leaned on facts. While others rehearsed insults, she rehearsed strategies. And it became clear very quickly. She wasn't just another politician. She was a fighter with a record of standing tall when the odds weren't in her favor. Her calm strength didn't mean she was quiet. It meant she was deliberate. When she raised her voice, it was because she chose to, not because she lost control. When she delivered a sharp retort, it wasn't reckless. It was calculated. That's why every time she clashed with someone like Jim Jordan, Mark Levin, or Karoline Leavitt, she left them stumbling. They were used to opponents who rattled easily. Crockett didn't rattle. And that brings us back to the lawsuit moment. As Leavitt spiraled, Crockett's silence wasn't just silence, it was mastery. It was years of practice, years of patience, years of learning that sometimes the loudest power comes not from shouting, but from waiting. She let Leavitt unravel herself, word by word, plea by plea. Crockett didn't need to interject. She didn't need to win the moment. The contrast between Leavitt's desperation and her own composure was the victory. It's also why her eventual response, the cold, cutting line that would shock the room, landed with the force it did. Because when someone like Crockett finally speaks after holding steady, you know the words are about to slice straight to the truth, but there's more to her calm strength than training. There's also perspective. Crockett knows what it's like to be underestimated. She knows what it's like to be dismissed. In many ways, she's lived through what Leavitt was experiencing in that hearing. People not taking her seriously. People trying to push her aside. The difference is, Crockett never begged for mercy. She fought for respect. That's why she could sit there unshaken, while Leavitt begged. She'd been on the other side of power games before. She knew their tricks, their bluffs, their theatrics. And she also knew, when the storm rages, the calmest voice wins. By the time Crockett finally leaned forward to speak, the entire room was already leaning toward her. The silence, the patience, the aura of control, it drew attention like a magnet. Everyone knew they were about to hear words that would carry weight. Words that weren't for show, but for history. Her reply was brief, cold, surgical. And it froze the room because it didn't just dismiss Leavitt, it dismantled the entire persona she had built. Crockett had no need for theatrics. Her strength was in being unmovable, untouchable, unshaken. And that's why this clash wasn't just about $80 million. It was about credibility. It was about composure. It was about one woman's arrogance colliding with another woman's resilience, and finding out resilience doesn't beg. Resilience doesn't crumble. Resilience waits, steadies, and strikes with precision. That day, Crockett didn't just respond to Karoline Leavitt. She defined herself once again to the nation as what so few in politics are: unflappable, unbought, and unstoppable. The room was already tense. You could feel it in the way staffers shifted nervously in their seats, in the way reporters leaned forward with their pens paused midair, waiting. Karoline Leavitt's begging had gone from embarrassing to desperate, her voice cracking under the pressure of her own unraveling. She repeated herself, clinging to the same hollow appeals, for the good of the party, for unity, to avoid distraction. Every word made her sound smaller, weaker, less like a politician in control, and more like a cornered figure staring at the wreckage of her career. But Jasmine Crockett, she hadn't moved, not once. Her hands were folded, her expression steady, her eyes fixed on Leavitt with the kind of piercing calm that can make even the loudest person feel exposed. It wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. Then came the moment. Crockett leaned forward, just slightly, but enough to shift the weight of the room. The murmurs hushed. The camera zoomed closer. And then, in a voice low enough to cut yet clear enough to echo across the chamber, she delivered the line that would become the headline, the soundbite, the turning point. Karoline, $80 million doesn't scare me, but accountability should scare you. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It was electric, heavy. You could hear the faint shuffle of papers, the click of a pen, the gasp of someone who hadn't expected Crockett to go for the jugular so quickly, so coldly. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. She didn't even need more than that single sentence. Because in those words, she had destroyed every one of Leavitt's arguments. She didn't just refuse to drop the lawsuit, she reframed it. It was no longer about money. It was about justice. It wasn't about distraction. It was about accountability. Leavitt opened her mouth, perhaps to reply, but nothing came out. The weight of Crockett's words had landed too hard. Her donors could no longer spin this. Her allies could no longer shield her. Because the moment Crockett said, accountability should scare you, she wasn't just speaking to Leavitt. She was speaking to every politician who thought they could dodge responsibility, every official who believed they were untouchable. The room shifted. Members of Congress who had been watching quietly suddenly looked more alert, some even smirking as if they knew history had just been made. Journalists scribbled furiously, their tweets already forming in their minds. And the public, those watching live feeds and clips soon to flood social media, knew instinctively this was one of those moments that would play again and again, on loop as a symbol of power meeting its limit. Crockett leaned back in her chair, unmoved, while Leavitt visibly shrank. It was a visual contrast too striking to ignore, the calm fighter versus the flailing pretender. Crockett didn't need another word. She had delivered the kill shot, and she knew it. And yet, the brilliance of that line wasn't just in its sharpness. It was in its precision. Crockett had taken the focus off money and placed it squarely where it belonged, on moral ground. By doing so, she forced everyone in that chamber and everyone watching to confront the bigger question. If Leavitt was so afraid of accountability, what was she hiding? The reaction outside the chamber was immediate. Social media lit up within minutes. Hashtags like "Knox accountability should scare you" trended nationally. Commentators compared it to some of the most memorable congressional takedowns in modern history. Supporters of Crockett framed it as a masterclass in discipline and power. No shouting, no theatrics, just one line that flipped the entire narrative. And for Leavitt, it was the unraveling. Every attempt she had made to save face, to minimize the lawsuit, to play politics with her plea, it all crumbled in that moment. Because Crockett had given the public a phrase, a weaponized truth they could repeat endlessly. And repetition is what destroys reputations in politics. The irony was undeniable. Leavitt had begged Crockett to drop the lawsuit to avoid public embarrassment. Instead, Crockett's refusal and her surgical reply made the embarrassment permanent. This wasn't a story that would vanish in a news cycle. This was a clip destined to replay across late-night shows, political ads, and viral reels. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't twist the knife. She simply let the words hang, knowing they would do the work for her. That's the kind of confidence born from years of battles, from experience in rooms where silence was a strategy, from understanding that sometimes the most devastating blows come not from rage, but from restraint. And so the chamber sat frozen. Leavitt, pale and defeated, shifted uncomfortably, realizing that her begging hadn't saved her. It had sealed her humiliation. Meanwhile, Crockett sat like a storm contained, calm and unbothered, the embodiment of a woman who knew she had just altered the course of the fight. But here's the thing about moments like these. They don't just end when the words do. The shock lingers, the ripples spread, and the consequences sharpen with time. Because Crockett's cold response wasn't just aimed at one desperate politician, it was aimed at an entire culture of impunity. And that's why what came next wasn't just fallout. It was transformation. The moment Jasmine Crockett uttered the words, "Accountability should scare you," the chamber froze. But outside those walls, the political world detonated. Within seconds, staffers and journalists sprinted to their phones. Tweets flew, hashtags erupted, and before Leavitt could even compose herself, Crockett's line was already a viral headline. The hashtag "accountability should scare you" shot to the top of Twitter trends. Memes poured in almost instantly. One showed Leavitt's panicked face under the caption, "When you realize $80 million isn't your biggest problem." Another had Crockett sitting calmly in black and white, with the words "the face of accountability" emblazoned in bold on cable news anchors, interrupted regular programming to replay the clip. MSNBC ran it on loop, their commentators marveling at how Crockett dismantled Leavitt without raising her voice. CNN analysts described it as a turning point in congressional discourse, while even conservative outlets, usually quick to shield Leavitt, couldn't avoid covering the devastating soundbite. Fox anchors attempted spin, claiming Crockett was grandstanding, but the attempt fell flat when viewers had already witnessed the clip in its raw form. The silence, the precision, the cold weight of her words, it was undeniable. The reaction wasn't confined to media circles. Law professors weighed in, praising Crockett's rhetorical mastery as an example of framing a debate around principle rather than theatrics. Activists applauded her for stripping away political games and laying bare the core issue: accountability. And ordinary citizens, many of whom had grown weary of seeing politicians dodge responsibility, found her words deeply validating. Comments flooded across social platforms. She said what we've all been screaming for years. Finally, someone who doesn't flinch. Crockett just ended an entire career with one sentence. For Karoline Leavitt, the fallout was brutal. Donors who once backed her unconditionally began to backpedal. In leaked emails, staffers privately questioned her leadership, with one aide writing, "We look weak. Begging was bad enough, but the way Crockett responded makes us look finished." Allies in Congress avoided her gaze in hallways, unwilling to be associated with a sinking ship. Her attempt to portray the lawsuit as a distraction backfired spectacularly, because now, the lawsuit wasn't the story. Her humiliation was. and Crockett had given it a moral dimension that made it impossible to spin away. Every time Leavitt tried to redirect attention, the clip of Crockett's line resurfaced, drowning her out. Meanwhile, Crockett's stock skyrocketed. Progressive leaders praised her poise. Civil rights groups highlighted her as a symbol of unshakable dignity in the face of arrogance. Late-night hosts hailed her with comedic admiration, with one declaring, "Jasmine Crockett just turned Congress into a masterclass in accountability." And Karoline Leavitt was the student who failed spectacularly. Even celebrities chimed in. Tweets of support rolled in from musicians, actors, and athletes, many quoting Crockett's words directly. The phrase became a rallying cry, painted on protest signs, printed on t-shirts, even turned into TikTok soundbites used by activists to call out hypocrisy in other contexts. Crockett had transcended the moment. She had turned it into a cultural symbol. But the most telling reactions came from within Congress itself. Lawmakers who rarely spoke on such matters privately admitted that Crockett had shifted the balance of power in the chamber. For years, figures like Leavitt had thrived on intimidation, mocking opponents with little consequence. But Crockett's response reminded everyone that arrogance wasn't invincible, that silence could be shattered, that accountability wasn't a weakness but a weapon. And then came the ripple effect. The lawsuits, the inquiries, the investigations that suddenly gained new momentum because public opinion had swung so sharply in favor of accountability. Crockett's words gave oxygen to movements demanding transparency and responsibility. It wasn't just about one lawsuit anymore. It was about a cultural demand for leaders to answer for their actions. For Leavitt, this was the nightmare scenario. She had begged for Crockett to drop the case to avoid humiliation. Instead, Crockett's cold refusal made that humiliation permanent, spreading it across every platform, every screen, every conversation. She wasn't just losing in court, she was losing in the court of public opinion. But Crockett? She didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. She knew that real power comes not from the noise of victory, but from the calm certainty of standing on the right side of history. Her words echoed not because they were loud, but because they were true. And as the news cycle churned, one truth became crystal clear. Karoline Leavitt's plea had backfired into a symbol of desperation, while Jasmine Crockett's reply had crystallized into a cultural moment of strength. Still, the question lingered. What would Crockett do next? Because if one cold line could freeze a chamber and shake an entire political landscape, the world could only imagine the impact of what was still to come. The chamber eventually resumed business, but the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's cold reply refused to fade. What happened that day didn't stay confined to one exchange. It spilled out, rippling through Congress, the media, and across the nation like a political earthquake. By nightfall, Crockett's line was no longer just a moment. It was a movement. On social media, the hashtag #DarmAccountability you had gone from a trending topic to a digital rallying cry. Activists adopted it to call out corruption in city governments, corporate misconduct, even celebrity scandals. The phrase appeared on posters at protests, stitched onto hoodies, and plastered across viral TikTok edits that racked up millions of views. Crockett's composure became the talking point. Commentators marveled at her restraint. No raised voice, no theatrics, just a single razor-sharp line that flipped the entire narrative. That subtlety gave the moment even more staying power. It wasn't just another political shouting match. It was a masterclass in poise. Meanwhile, the fallout for Karoline Leavitt deepened. She tried to brush off the moment, calling it political theater, but the public wasn't buying it. Every time she spoke, the clip replayed. Every attempt at deflection was drowned out by Crockett's words. Allies who once admired her firebrand persona now questioned her judgment. Some quietly began distancing themselves, wary of becoming collateral damage in her spiral. The lawsuit itself, once seen as a distraction, suddenly became the centerpiece of national debate. Journalists who had barely covered it before now pored over every detail. Legal experts debated its implications on primetime panels. Crockett's refusal to back down reframed it, not as a personal feud, but as a test of whether accountability truly meant something in American politics. And beyond the legalities, the cultural impact was undeniable. Schools used the clip in debate clubs as an example of rhetorical precision. Opinion pieces praised Crockett's ability to pierce through noise with clarity. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist turning the moment into a monologue highlight. But perhaps the most striking shift was among ordinary citizens. In town halls, community meetings, and online forums, people quoted Crockett's line as if it were a mantra. Voters who had felt disillusioned by endless political bickering suddenly saw in her a figure who embodied not just resistance, but dignity. She wasn't shouting for the sake of sound bites. She was reminding everyone that accountability still mattered. And so, the shockwaves continued. Crockett had not just silenced Leavitt, she had redefined the stakes of the fight. What began as one lawsuit transformed into a broader symbol of courage against arrogance, of composure against chaos, of truth against power games. But as the nation replayed that cold response, one question began to surface. If Jasmine Crockett could freeze Congress with one line, what might she unleash next when the stakes grew even higher? In the end, what set Crockett apart wasn't just her sharpness or her courage, it was the clarity of her moral compass. When Karoline Leavitt begged her to abandon the lawsuit, Crockett could have relented. She could have chosen the path of convenience, of compromise, of letting arrogance walk away unscathed. But she didn't. She stood her ground calmly, firmly, without apology. Her words, "Accountability should scare you," weren't crafted for applause. They weren't designed as a performance. They were a reminder of something deeper, that public service is supposed to be about responsibility, not immunity. That leadership is supposed to be about truth, not bluster, and that the American people deserve representatives who value justice over personal gain. For too long, politics has been dominated by figures like Leavitt, loud voices, empty promises, endless arrogance. They thrive on noise, on distraction, on making accountability look like an inconvenience rather than a duty. But Crockett flipped the script. She proved that dignity could be louder than insults, that silence, when wielded with principle, could be stronger than shouting. Her stance carried a universal message. To every leader tempted to abuse power, it was a warning. You can dodge questions, you can posture for cameras, but eventually accountability will find you. And when it does, no amount of begging will erase the truth. To the public, her response offered something even more valuable: hope. Hope that in a system often clouded by corruption, there are still voices willing to stand firm. Hope that justice isn't an empty word, but a standard we can demand. Hope that when arrogance meets principle, principle can still prevail. Crockett's refusal wasn't just a legal move, it was a cultural one. It gave Americans a reason to believe that power doesn't have to corrupt absolutely, that some representatives still carry the weight of the people's trust with pride. And it reminded us that accountability isn't a threat to democracy, it's the very thing that keeps it alive. In that chamber, Leavitt's begging revealed the fragility of arrogance, but Crockett's cold response revealed the strength of integrity. And as history replays that exchange, one truth will remain: dignity, when armed with principle, can silence even the loudest of voices. The clip of Jasmine Crockett looking Karoline Leavitt dead in the eye and saying accountability should scare you will live far beyond that congressional chamber. It was more than a takedown. It was a declaration. A declaration that arrogance has an expiration date, and that the people's demand for justice cannot be silenced. They cut through the noise. They remind us what true leadership looks like. And they give us hope that integrity can still stand tall against corruption. Crockett didn't need to shout, didn't need theatrics. Her calm strength froze the room and sent shockwaves across the nation. But here's the truth. One voice, no matter how powerful, can't carry this fight alone. If Jasmine Crockett's stand inspired you, if you believe accountability should always matter, then this is the time to amplify her message. Share this story. Keep the conversation alive. Show that the American people are watching, and we will not reward arrogance with silence. Because in the end, this isn't just about one lawsuit or one courtroom clash. It's about who we are as a nation. Do we let arrogance rule unchecked? Or do we demand dignity, truth, and accountability from those who claim to lead us? The answer is in your hands. If you stand with Jasmine Crockett's courage, let it be known. Subscribe, share, and add your voice to the chorus, demanding that accountability never be optional, it must be inevitable.